From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. Up until this week, I was the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which indeed is sponsoring this talk. But through different sets of circumstances, which please me very much, I've started a new position, which is a historian of the Library of Congress, and I'm going to be developing a new history office about the library for the library. But I'm exercising my prerogative as the founding director of the Center for the Book by not only introducing our speaker today, but also on Thursday we have a second talk related to elections and the year, and I will be coming back to do some of those introductions as we move into a new phase in the history of the Center for the Book. The center was created by Daniel Boorstin when he was Librarian of Congress in 1977. And he plucked me out of the ranks to become the founding director because largely of my interest he knew of my interest in the history of the library. And here we are all these years later still having a chance to show my interest and to keep learning about the Library of Congress. Dr. Boorstin's idea was that we, the library, should do more to reach out to the general public to promote books and reading. And as the Center for the Book has grown, we have done so, but we've added literacy promotion, we've added library promotion. The center was created as a partnership between the private sector. We were started with donations from publishers, McGraw-Hill, actually, and Time Life Books, and continued to really support most of our activities by private donations, often related to projects. But the Library of Congress supports our positions, and as we have grown, we have also created the first Young Readers Center. It's the first part of the library that's open to the interests and programming for 16 and under. And it is in the Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress. We also are closely associated with the National Book Festival, which came to the Library of Congress with Laura Bush in 2001, and we just celebrated our 15th annual festival last year, and I can announce that this year's festival is September 24th. We've now moved off the mall into the Washington Convention Center, and it's bigger and better than ever, and in addition has toilets and air conditioning inside. So, and actually the programming opportunities are much greater too, as you can well imagine. You've joined us for a Books and Beyond program. Thank you. The Books and Beyond series started in 1996, and the notion was to have author talks about books that were related to the Library of Congress one way or another, often, as is the case today, and often is the case. The author has made good use of the Library of Congress's resources, but we also look for books that have other kinds of relationships to the library. For example, they were published by the library, which obviously will be related to our collections, or maybe they are a result of a special project from the Library of Congress. But since 1996, we're approaching 400 of these talks. And one of the nice features about them is that the Library of Congress films them for its website, as we actually film the author presentations for the National Book Festival. But in the Books and Beyond series, we now are, as I said, approaching 400, and of those, around 300 of them have been filmed. We didn't get started quite when we should have with the filming, but all of the talks, including today's talk, are filmed, so I ask you to kindly turn off all things electronic. We will hear from our speaker, then we will have a question and answer period, and then finally there'll be a book signing, at about 1 o'clock. It needs to start by 1 o'clock for certain. As you know, our talk today is The Fight to Vote, and it's by Michael Waldman, who is here to talk about the book and to sign it. Michael is a constitutional lawyer and an expert on the presidency and American democracy. And he too has the right job. Since 2005, he has been president of the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law, a nonpartisan law and policy institute that focuses on improving the systems. How's this for a purpose and a goal? It focuses on improving the systems of democracy and justice. And I learned today the Brennan Center also has an office in Washington, and there is some literature out on our literature tables where you also will find out more about the Center for the Book and our future programs during the book signing period. Under Michael's leadership, the Brennan Center has become a leading legal voice on election law, constitutional law, government reform, and racial justice. 2 years ago, he tackled the tough constitutional issue of the Second Amendment, and he chronicled his discoveries and has made his analysis in a widely reviewed and praised book, The Second Amendment, a Biography. And we were privileged to have him speak here at the Center for the Book at the Library of Congress almost 2 years ago to the day. It was on June 24th, 2014. Now, nearly 2 days to the day later, we are lucky to have him here to discuss his new book, The Fight to Vote, which is an analysis of a crucial American struggle very much on our minds today. And I think I mentioned we have a talk on the history of American elections, not elections as much as the presidential power and the presidencies and the families related to the presidency on Thursday when Stephen Hess will be here. But today we're going to be able to hear Michael talk about his second book that we've featured, and it too is really getting excellent reviews, and we're very pleased that he can be here to talk about Fight to Vote. It's so important in our democracy right now, and certainly on our minds right now, what really constitutes the definition of the consent of the governed and how the right to vote is a crucial part of it. So please join me in welcoming Michael Waldman. Michael, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you for all you have done for the book and for our democracy by making so many of the ideas available and by lifting up the idea of us coming together as a national community around these discussions and debates. Thank you to the Library of Congress. I want to acknowledge and thank my friend Rafe Segallen, who is the agent for me and for so many of the great authors whose work is in the walls of this building, and my colleagues from the Brennan Center. It is a challenging and exciting time to work on these issues. I appreciate all of you coming today also at a time of great sorrow for our country. It is striking to walk from Union Station to here, seeing the flags at half-mast and understanding that the country at a moment like this can come together with a militant rededication to the ideals we all share together. This book tells part of the story of those ideals and how we forged them and how we try to live up to them and how hard that often can be. I am asked all the time, why did I write this book now? And actually, the first question I'm often asked these days is, so do you still support the right to vote? And I generally answer yes. But even before this topsy-turvy election, this was a period where the institutions of American democracy, the institutions of our electoral system, have been under pressure and facing strains they have not felt in years and years. This is going to be an election where in 17 states, new voting laws are on the books. For the first time in a high turnout election, laws that I believe actually make it harder for many Americans to vote. It's the first time in half a century that we have a presidential election without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was weakened gravely by the Supreme Court. It's the first presidential election where the full force of Citizens United and other recent Supreme Court rulings on money in politics are being felt throughout our system. And it is a not uncomplicated story, but here's just an example of the kind of impact we are seeing. In the last election, in the 2014 election, the top 100 donors, federal donors, gave more than the 4.75 million small donors combined. That is a level of concentrated political wealth we haven't seen since the Gilded Age in the United States. Add all this on top of the ongoing normal problems of our electoral system, partisan gerrymandering, ramshackle voter registration and election administration systems, and voting machines, and all the other things that people know about. And it is not a surprise that voter turnout in the last election plunged to the lowest level in 72 years. And that was during the middle of World War II, when a lot of Americans were overseas fighting, and so in a sense they had an excuse. These are signs of strain and stress on our democracy, on the meaning of that right to vote. And so what I wanted to understand for myself, for my colleagues, and for our readers was why is this happening now? Is it unusual? And what turns out to be the case, when you look back at the long sweep of history, is that the strains we're facing now, the fights we're having now, the fact that the right to vote seems to require a fight to vote, that is consequential. These debates are fierce, they are challenging, but they are not new. In fact, this question of the fight to vote has been at the center of American history from the very beginning. It's been at the heart of political debates. It's often been a fulcrum for elections. It's a fight that has been raw and rowdy and often very, very partisan from the beginning. And just as we might see now, throughout history, as many Americans have demanded their place at the table, have claimed their voice in our democracy, many others have fought just as hard to stop them, to restrict that right to vote. And so that is ultimately the context, the usable history I was seeking to find in understanding today's moment, today's fights. And as I say, this goes back all the way to the beginning. This is not a fight that started last year or 50 years ago in Selma, Alabama. It's been going on for 240 years at least. At the time the nation was founded, as we all know, it was far from anything any of us would consider a democracy. The book begins, fittingly, as we sit in the Jefferson Building, in the Madison Building across from the Jefferson Building. The book begins actually with Thomas Jefferson sitting at his desk in Philadelphia, writing the preamble to the Declaration of Independence and stating in that famous preamble that government is legitimate only if it rests on the consent of the governed. And that was a radical idea then as well as now. And it had a tremendous force, a tremendous power, and obviously was not the reality at that moment. Among other things, as I note, Jefferson, while he was writing that, was attended to by a 14-year-old slave boy, Bob Hemings, Sally Hemings' younger brother. But the idea took on a life of its own. And one of the things that was interesting is we all know, we remember from school perhaps, that at that time when we were not a democracy, only white men who owned property were allowed to vote. That was the tradition, in effect, handed down from England and the continent. But even then, it was controversial. The power of those revolutionary ideals began to crack the certainty that surrounded that approach. In 1776, in Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin led a working man's revolt in one of the only places in the whole revolution where it really looked like, the French Revolution, where a giant throng of people stormed the State House. He led a working man's revolt, demanding a new government and demanding as its key element that the property requirement for voting be ended. He actually was the president of the convention that wrote the Constitution of Pennsylvania. It was the world's most radical constitution at the time. And he said, this is how he explained it, he said, there's a man who owns a jackass, and it's worth $50, so the man can vote. Then the jackass dies. The man is older, he understands more about government, but the jackass is still dead, so the man cannot vote. So therefore, he asked, who really has the right to vote, the man or the jackass? This seemed pretty persuasive in Pennsylvania, and they created the most democratic constitution the world had ever seen. Up in Massachusetts, John Adams reflected the other strain. He was aghast at this notion of expanding the right to vote, of expanding American democracy. He wrote their constitution. He was urged to do the same thing, to end the property requirement. And he wrote, he said, if you do that, he said, women will demand the right to vote. Lads of 18 will think their interests insufficiently attended to, and they will demand the right to vote. And men, he said, who have not a farthing to their name will think themselves worthy of an equal voice in government, and they will demand the right to vote. Adams said, there will be no end of it. And that's basically the book. That's basically the story of what happened over the next 2.5 centuries. The idea that government rested on the consent of the governed and that the vote was the center of that consent took on a life of its own. And it's worth noting in this wonderful building named after James Madison, as you know, Madison's notes are our principal basis for understanding what the conversations were at the Constitutional Convention. And the Constitution does not originally refer to a right to vote. There was even a move to put that property requirement into the Constitution, which Madison shrugged off. He didn't think it was such a bad idea, but he didn't think it was a good idea. And Franklin actually blocked it with his prestige. We only know those notes because they were released many decades later. But when the doors opened up and it came time to fight for the ratification of the Constitution in that very controversial debate, where the anti-federalists, as they were called, made a very strong case against the Constitution, one of the issues was this question of whether it was a counter-revolution, whether it was elitist, whether the ordinary people would be cut out. And Madison and the other founders, even the ones who didn't believe it, went to the country and said, no, this is about democracy. In Federalist 57, Madison asked the question, he said, who are to be the electors of the new government? Not the rich more than the poor, not the learned more than the ignorant, not the haughty heirs of famous names more than the humble sons of obscurity and unpropitious fortune. The great body of the people are to be the electors. That's as compelling a definition of democracy as we could find even now. And again, that took on a life of its own. In the 1820s and the 1830s was the first great breakthrough for this expanded right to vote. And in the modern political context, it's worth noting it was won by the angry white working class men of the time, the period of Jacksonian democracy, when states all across the country ended that property requirement for white men in voting. And one of the interesting and, for me, slightly unexpected storylines throughout all of this is that victory for voting rights was not won by voting rights groups or a lawsuit or citizen activists. It was waged and won by political parties, by politicians, by cynical insiders often. One of the great leaders in that fight was Martin Van Buren, who was the governor of New York and then president. And Van Buren helped to found the world's first mass political party, the Democratic Party, as we now call it, around this issue of wider suffrage. And he was no firebrand. There's a story from the time that Albany was notoriously corrupt even then as a state capital, and one state senator bet another. He said, I bet you I can get Van Buren to give a straight answer to a simple question. And the other guy took the bet, and he went up to Van Buren and said, Mr. Van Buren, tell me, is it true that the sun rises in the east? And Van Buren said, well, seeing as how I never wake up that early, I cannot speak to that from personal experience, so I don't know the answer to that. So he led the fight to expand voting rights. And this role of insiders, the role of politicians and political parties, is a significant storyline throughout this that recurs and often surprises. The next great breakthrough, of course, albeit one that was tragically cut short, came during and after the Civil War, because the expansion of the vote to working class white men, the idea that we were a democracy, the almost faddish devotion to political participation that you saw around the country, again set up the demand for the next great breakthrough. At the end of the Civil War, as the book describes, Frederick Douglass and the other abolitionists realized that the next great fight was to enfranchise the former slaves, to extend the right to vote to black men. And Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, was opposed to extending the right to vote to the former slaves. He was ardently against it. He campaigned against it. But on this, as on so many other issues, the war changed Lincoln. By the end of the war, 1 out of 10 Union soldiers was a black man. When Lincoln, just a few hundred yards from here, gave his famous second inaugural address, back when the inaugurals were on this side of the Capitol, half the audience were African American men and women, many of them in uniform. And 3 days after Appomattox, 3 days after the surrender by Robert E. Lee, Lincoln gave his first major speech on Reconstruction, on what he wanted to have happen after the Civil War. It was a long speech. He gave it from the second floor window of the White House by candlelight. And in the middle of the speech, he said, now, I've been criticized, because his original plans for Reconstruction did not extend voting rights. And he said, I've been criticized for not extending the right to vote. And I now agree with that criticism. In fact, I think that there should be the right to vote for those who served in the military, for those who are intelligent. He went through some categories. And actually, at a cabinet meeting a few days later, he made clear to his cabinet that he was likely to go the whole way. At least one member of the audience, historians tell us, caught the significance of what Lincoln said. John Wilkes Booth was there. And when Lincoln said this, Booth gasped, that means citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever give. And he, in fact, tried to get the guy at that moment to shoot Lincoln on the spot, the guy standing next to him. And when he wouldn't do it, Booth said, well, then by God, I will put him through. And 2 days later, went to Ford's Theater and did that. This was the case that Booth was, I'm not meaning to imply that Booth was a big Lincoln fan other than that. His previous idea had been, to kidnap him and bring him south. But the spark for the assassination, we are told, was in fact Lincoln's conversion to the cause of voting rights. And this was, as it turns out, one of the great central fights, one of the great central issues in Reconstruction. And again, one where partisanship played a significant positive role in expanding the right to vote. This time it was the Republican Party, which pushed through the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibited discrimination, which said that the right to vote could not be abridged because of race. And it's important to note, as I said, this is a partisan issue. The identity of which party is pushing for greater voting rights and which party is pushing against voting rights often changes, often switches. It's not always one party or another. In this case, it was the Republicans. They did this out of a mix of idealism and political calculus to help win the black vote in the border states. But it's also worth noting that I mentioned that the phrase, the right to vote, the notion of a right to vote, was not in the Constitution. And you'll hear people say that all the time, that it's not in the Constitution, there's no right to vote. Well, it wasn't in the original Constitution. But starting with the 15th Amendment, and actually the 14th Amendment before that, it has been added to the Constitution 5 separate times explicitly. There is a right to vote in the Constitution. It's in there more than just about any other topic. But it was added after the original Constitution, and this was one of the most significant times. And what many Americans for a long time did not realize, and we now all understand, is that there was a flowering of democracy in the South after the 15th Amendment. Voter participation rates among African American men reached 90%. Hundreds were elected to state legislatures, to Congress, to governorships, even to the U.S. Senate. And then, as we know, it was cruelly, effectively revoked. First, by terrorism, by the Ku Klux Klan and other paramilitary groups, which were serving in effect as a military wing of the Democratic Party. This is not. We all understand the perils of living in an age of terrorism. We are not living in either the first or the greatest age of terrorism in the United States. That was after the Civil War. The violence drove many people away from the polls, and then cowardice. And a cynical deal struck to settle the 1876 presidential election that saw the troops withdrawn from the South and effectively ended, for a century or so, the national government's effort to protect the right to vote for the former slaves and their descendants. One of the things that was interesting is that it didn't happen right away. Voter turnout rates among black men was actually quite high in the South for decades after that. It wasn't until the Jim Crow constitutions of the 1890s, which formally and creatively and systematically disenfranchised black voters, that it was completely done. And as many of you know, that central fact, what was called in those days the Solid South, the all-white Democratic Party South, with very low voter participation rates of any kind, was the central political fact in American government for decades and decades, well into the 20th century, into my lifetime. What a lot of people don't know is that during this period, in the late 19th century, something similar happened in the North. Not as bad, but something similar. The cities of the North during this time were filled with immigrants. And they weren't immigrants from Mexico. They were from Ireland and Italy and Russia and Poland and other European countries. And a lot of the established institutions, a lot of the blue bloods of the time reacted with language that would be very familiar to us today. And in fact, many of them decided that this idea of universal voting rights wasn't such a good idea after all. John Adams, great-grandson, said that if you have universal suffrage, you will have a government of corruption and vice, dominated, as he said, by the Celtic proletariat in the North, the African proletariat in the South, and the Chinese proletariat in the West. So it turned out that voting rights wasn't such a good idea after all. Two of my favorite surprises during that period, one of the great leaders of the opposition to the right to vote was E.L. Godkin, who founded The Nation magazine. And Walt Whitman wrote ardently against democracy at this point and against the right to vote for the same reasons. And what you saw throughout the North were a series of laws and a series of practices, some of them quite defensible on their face, that effectively made it much harder for working people, for non-English speakers, for non-educated people, for poor people to vote. Everything from voter registration, which was a new thing, imposed in many places only in Democratic and Catholic big cities and not in Republican and rural areas out in the countryside. Even something like the printed ballot, which means you had to be able to read it, or the secret ballot, which meant similarly that you had to process who you were voting for on your own. Things that we obviously think are important parts of what it means to run a clean and honest democracy. All these various things made it harder and harder and harder. The other crackdowns on the often corrupt but highly participatory political parties of the time meant that voter turnout rates began to really plummet in the late 1800s. And then you added on top of that a new factor, which began at that time and which, of course, we're living with now, which is the role of big money in American politics, which had not been a factor until the late 1800s. But now, with the tremendous inequality of that Gilded Age time, the campaign money from the robber barons began to dominate politics at the very moment that the vote was being pushed back. So in many ways, American democracy slid backwards in the late 1800s, and it's an important lesson because we think of the beginning where we were had a kernel of the democratic idea, but that we've expanded it over time, and that's true. And it's true, as Dr. King said, talking about voting rights, that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But it sometimes goes backwards. Then what happened after that period in the late 19th century is something else that also happens with some recurring frequency, which is there was a response. There was a period of reform and renewal, very significantly in response to what had happened. Now, we know it, of course, as the Progressive Era. And when we learn about the Progressive Era and we think about it, it's certainly the case that it was, in a lot of respects, very similar to our time in terms of the public's concerns. People were unsettled by economic change. They were unsettled by the new degree of inequality that had come into the American economy. They were unnerved by demographic change, by immigration. They felt that the political system was rigged. They felt that government was not functional, that it was not working given the challenges of that time. And we think about the Progressive Era as being when the beginnings of the modern governmental system was built, food safety regulation or antitrust laws, and that's all true. But to the progressives of the time, they felt that restoring and revitalizing the institutions of American democracy and expanding the vote were critical to their efforts. They passed the first campaign finance laws, some of which were affected by Citizens United. They passed the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which to them was a central campaign finance reform effort. That was the amendment that gave the right to vote to people for senators. Previously, it had been state legislatures who elected senators, and they felt that the state legislatures were corrupt and were dominated by big special interests, and that giving that vote to a much wider group would change that. And by the way, when you hear today, some people actually urge the revocation of the 17th Amendment, saying that it was a power grab by Washington imposed on the states. It's actually the other way around. The U.S. Senate was the last place that wanted to do the 17th Amendment. It was actually demanded by the states and by the people of the states at the time. And we know that they expanded direct democracy, referenda, and a whole host of other ways that this vote gained more power. And they took the single, in numeric terms, the single biggest step to expand the vote, which is the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing the right to vote to women. And we sort of skip over this one often in our thinking of American democracy. We know it happened. But it turns out that the fight for the vote for women, for that 19th Amendment, was every bit as fiercely contested, as dramatic, as any voting rights fight before or since. And there are many stories that we learned for the first time, those of us at the Brennan Center, and we work on this stuff day and night. We know, and Secretary Clinton mentioned this in her speech the other day, that in 1848 at Seneca Falls was the first time that the demand for a right to vote for women was really put forward by the Seneca Falls Declaration. The fact is, not a whole lot happened after that. For decades and decades, not a whole lot happened after that. And it was not until 1911 when a small group of very young women, many of them had been in graduate school in England, where they participated in the suffrage movement there, came back to the United States and, in the face of kind of eye-rolling by their elders, said that they were going to try something really audacious. They were going to actually try to pass a constitutional amendment to give women the right to vote. Just 3 months later, the day before his inauguration as president, Woodrow Wilson got off the train a few blocks from here and was expecting to be greeted by a giant throng, and there was basically nobody there. There was the Princeton Glee Club, and that was it. They belted out a song, and the New York Times wrote, They made up in enthusiasm what they lacked in numbers. They were very pro-Democrat even then. And finally, Wilson's aide said, where are all the people? And the hosts said with sort of embarrassment, well, they're actually all down on Pennsylvania Avenue, where there was, for the very first time, a march for women's suffrage down Pennsylvania Avenue the day before the presidential inaugural. 5,000 women marching for the right to vote. At the head of the parade was a 27-year-old woman on a white horse named Inez Milholland, dressed in the costume of a Greek goddess, carrying a banner of sort of a hallucinatory figure. And we're especially fond of her because she was a recent graduate of NYU School of Law, where the Brennan Center is, and 5,000 women. And on either side, 100,000 men flanking Pennsylvania Avenue. They were there for the inaugural. Many of them were drunk. And they started spitting and throwing things. They broke through the lines and assaulted the women, beat them up, sent 100 women to the hospital. They had to fight their way down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Treasury Department, where the march ended. And it was a very big deal. It was massively publicized. The publicity overshadowed the inauguration in many ways. The police chief of Washington, D.C. had to resign. And public opinion swung in support of voting rights for women. And when I learned this story, I thought, and perhaps some of you are having the same thought, that sounds just like Selma. That this publicized attack on nonviolent protesters for the right to vote, revealing the injustice of it, changing broader public opinion. And it was 50 years before Selma, and it took 5 more years, and a pioneering use of strategies and tactics of protest that really began with the suffrage movement in the United States. Everything from hunger strikes. They picketed the White House for 2 years straight. They ran political candidates against Woodrow Wilson in states where they could. A whole host of things. All of this before Gandhi used a lot of these tactics in India, certainly before the sit-down strikes and the American labor movement in the 30s, and obviously before the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And finally, in 1920, won the right to vote. And the electorate, the size of the electorate, doubled in one fell swoop. It was an extraordinary breakthrough. Much of the 20th century, there was this continued inexorable pressure, but there were a lot of ongoing problems that built up and built up. And the true ultimate breakthrough, which I won't go into much detail about because it's something you know the most about, came with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, when for the very first time, really, we as a country articulated the expectation that every eligible citizen would be able to vote. And it was accompanied at the time by a constitutional amendment ending the poll tax, by another constitutional amendment lowering the voting age to 18. All I will say in terms of the Voting Rights Act is that it too was the product of political forces that were complex and intense. And obviously the principal movers of that Voting Rights Act were the ordinary people who braved violence and even death in Selma, Alabama during the great voting rights struggle and march there. But it's also the case that it was the product of this incredibly fascinating dual joust between these two viscerally talented Southern political leaders, Dr. Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson. And this is one of the questions that arose after the movie Selma was, did Johnson get did he get a fair treatment in that movie? And I certainly came out of the research concluding no, he did not. Johnson was most of the time strongly for and extremely important in the fight for voting rights, but King and Johnson pushed and pulled with each other. And so much of their interaction was taped. And so you can hear these incredible conversations. I mean, 3 days before Bloody Sunday, the Friday before, King came to the White House and met with Johnson. And Johnson did not tell King, by the way, Dr. King, I've ordered the Justice Department to draft the Voting Rights Act over the objection of the liberals who were there, actually. I've ordered them to draft it, and we've negotiated it with the Republicans in the Senate already. And King did not tell Johnson, by the way, Mr. President, turn on your TV on Sunday. We're marching in Selma. The reaction, of course, to that public violence created a spontaneous national mass movement demanding action that enabled Johnson, both pushed Johnson and enabled him to then go before the Congress a week later and give that great speech where he said, "We shall overcome," embracing the slogan of the Civil Rights Movement. And during this period and after, American democracy achieved a formal openness, a formal equality that it had never had before. And when I was growing up, when I was learning this stuff, that was sort of, you put your pencils down. That was the status quo, and that was the expectation. It was expected that these issues were a thing of the past and that they weren't the subject of intense current fighting. Well, that is not how it's turned out. The last 15 years has seen, once again, as we've seen throughout American history, tremendous focus on these rules of democracy. And I think a lot of it actually started with the recount in Florida in 2000, probably about 4 a.m, that first night, when people realized the country was really closely divided, that turnout now mattered a lot, and that you could win an election by manipulating the system or by turning your side out or by suppressing the other side. And you began to see, as a strategy, building over time, a drive to restrict voting rights, claim it, and this is where I get to the contemporary part where I will note that, as I said, this is often a partisan fight. It's often been the Democrats who've been on the side of restricting or expanding the right to vote. It's often been the Republicans who were the most for example, women's voting rights, who've been on the side of expanding or constricting the right to vote. Right now in America, today, it is the conservative movement and the Republican Party that is pushing for these laws to make it harder for people to vote. And the argument is made that this is necessary to stop voter fraud. The only kind of voter fraud that these laws really address, it would be in-person voter impersonation, someone walking in claiming to be someone they're not. And every bit of research will tell you that that is you are more likely to be hit by lightning in the United States, statistically, than to commit in-person voter impersonation. Despite this concerted strategic effort, not a whole lot happened until 2011. In 2011, a lot of state legislatures changed hands. And instantly, you saw laws being passed all over the place to make it harder to vote. 19 states passed 24 new laws in a few months' time. They ranged from harsh and restrictive new forms of voter ID to cutbacks in early voting, but especially on the days used by African Americans, to ending Election Day registration, to crackdowns on voter registration drives, a whole host of things. The Brennan Center, we played a bit of a role in this, in that this was happening in public, obviously. This was not a secret. It was in state legislatures, but the dots had not been connected. And a year before, in October of 2011, we put out a report. We looked at all of this stuff and concluded that 5 million people might have their right to vote restricted or affected, or even lost. And that helped kick off a big national debate. It helped kick off an awareness on the part of a lot of people that this was a political stratagem being carried out. And so that when we and other voting rights groups went to court in 2012, the spring of 2012, every single one of the worst new laws was blocked or blunted or postponed or repealed. And it didn't matter if it was a Republican judge or a Democratic judge or a state judge or a federal judge. They understood that there was something fundamental and sacred in the right to vote that was actually improperly being affected. And that was kind of where it stood until the Supreme Court got involved, which is a much more divided and much more, frankly, partisan court than you find in most other courthouses. As you may know, in 2013, the Supreme Court, in a case called Shelby County versus Holder, struck down the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which everybody acknowledged was the most successful civil rights law in American history. This was the part of the law that required states with a history of discrimination in voting to get voting changes cleared in advance by the Justice Department or a federal court. And this was the ruling. This was during the arguments across the street, down the block. This was the case where Justice Scalia said in the courtroom that he thought that the Voting Rights Act was nothing more than, as he put it, a racial entitlement, which actually elicited gasps in the courtroom. But he didn't write the opinion. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion. And he made a point which has some validity. He said, voter participation rates among African Americans in many places, including in the South, are now higher than among white voters. His main argument, in effect, was that was then, this is now. Therefore, it's not needed anymore. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a famous dissent in that case. She said that that's like standing in a rainstorm, holding an umbrella and not getting wet, and deciding, therefore, that you can throw away the umbrella. So who was right? Who was right as a predictive matter of what would happen? 2 hours after the ruling came down, the state of Texas implemented its voter ID law. And I should say, I'm actually for voter ID. I'm not against voter ID. I think it makes sense for people to have to be who they say they are, and it's not crazy to ask them to prove it. I'm against requiring forms of ID that lots of people don't have. Nationwide, around 11% of eligible voters don't have a driver's license or the other kind of ID that's required. In Texas, 2 hours later, the law was implemented. It's the harshest law in the country. It's kind of notorious. It's the one where you cannot use your University of Texas ID as a government ID, but you can use your concealed carry gun permit. And Stephen Colbert said, well, that's actually very democratic. It's a lot easier to get a gun than a college education. But the partisan intent was fairly naked. And at that precise moment, 2 hours after the Supreme Court ruled, 608,000 registered voters in Texas lost their right to vote. Not potential, maybe they'd vote someday. Registered voters. Disproportionately African American, disproportionately Latino, disproportionately poor, disproportionately either the elderly or the young. And one of those voters was a woman who we met named Sammy Louise Bates. We and others went to court on this, and we met Sammy Louise Bates. Now, she was born in Mississippi. She remembered counting out money for her grandmother to pay the poll tax. She moved to Detroit and Chicago, sort of the classic Great Migration. She actually went to college. She worked. Then she retired, and she moved to Texas, Round Rock, Texas, where she lives on Social Security and nothing else. She's been voting since she was 21 years old, and she lost the right to vote. We asked her, why didn't you just get your birth certificate from Mississippi? Why didn't you go through the process and get your birth certificate from Mississippi? And she said, well, that costs $42. And I had to put those $42 where they would do the most good. You can't eat a birth certificate. And she was the lead witness in the federal trial, and with many others, persuaded the federal judge to strike down the law as discriminatory, illegal, violating the remaining parts of the Voting Rights Act and the Constitution. That ruling was upheld by the most conservative federal appeals court in the country, the Fifth Circuit, and the law is still on the books. It's still in effect. It's going to be in effect in November because the simplified answer is Texas is appealing very slowly. And the wheels of justice are grinding very slowly. And ultimately, this is not a fight that will be won in the court of law, but in the court of public opinion. And so we have every reason to expect a lot of hand-to-hand combat in courtrooms all over the country, a lot of drives to make it possible for people to vote. We think that these new laws will affect polling places, certainly, where we've seen already evidence that they cause long lines and chaos. And there's reason to be worried. But there is also, I'll say, in conclusion, reason for optimism. Why would there be optimism? Other than temperament, why would there be optimism? Just as perhaps we saw in the early 20th century this focus on the rules of democracy, this recognition that some people are trying to take away others' right to vote, this recognition that the system needs to be changed if we want to solve our problems, is creating its own moment of pushback, of renewal. One hopes of revitalization of these institutions. There's actually a tremendous ferment going on the issues of democracy all over the country. Plainly, we see this in the election in both parties, whether it's Bernie Sanders saying he's winning these primaries because of his position on campaign finance, or Donald Trump saying that he's the only one who can't be bought, or Hillary Clinton putting out what I regard as by far the most robust set of policy reform proposals on this stuff, although she talks about it in a more muted way. This issue is at the center of debate again. And you're seeing breakthroughs on these issues all across the country. The single biggest change that could make a big difference in our voting right now would be to change the way we register voters in the United States. If we move to automatic voter registration, automatic and universal registration, which is how every other democracy does it, if we made it so that if you're eligible to vote, the government has the list, it's responsible for keeping the list, and you stay on the list, it would add 50 million people to the rolls permanently. It would cost less, and for people who are worried about fraud, it would address the accuracy of the lists. It would clean up the lists, and it would make it harder to abuse. And the exciting thing is it's starting to happen all over the country. In the last year and a half, Oregon, California, West Virginia by a bipartisan vote, Vermont by a tripartisan vote, they got the Democrats and the Republicans and the Socialists all to vote for it, enacted automatic voter registration for people who interact with the DMV in those states. And they could broaden it out to other agencies too. We had a conference a couple of weeks ago, and the state of Connecticut officials came and announced that the night before they decided they were going to do it without even waiting for their legislature. The Illinois legislature last week passed this. While we don't know if Governor Rauner is going to sign it, there are enough votes to override a veto. We expect that if that happens, then 1 out of 5 voters will now be living in states with automatic registration. We know from Oregon it has tripled the registration rates month by month there. It would be a tremendous breakthrough, and it's happening all over the country. And there are things like that that are happening. Creative new versions of public financing being enacted for campaign finance. Redistricting reform, such as redistricting commissions, being approved of by the Supreme Court last year and pushed in states, whether it was Ohio, where Governor Kasich backed it, or California, where Governor Schwarzenegger, or Florida, where it was the liberal Democrats who pushed a redistricting reform. It's sort of both parties gerrymander with gusto, and the reform is actually genuinely bipartisan as a result. There is a lot happening. So that's really the question. We are on the knife's edge. We could be in a period like the late 19th century. And the signs are there, where our democracy slides backward, where participation recedes, where the right to vote takes on less meaning. Or, as I hope and believe is more likely to be the case, we could be in a period like what followed, a time of renewal, of activism on these issues that helps create a new moment for American democracy. Ultimately, even if this happens, it won't be over. John Adams was right. There will be no end of it. It will be, there will never be a point where we're not fighting over what it means to have a democracy. But the next chapter will be written by all of us and those who come after. So, thank you. I'm happy to take questions. Rafe?
I just think this is something simple to be so consequential. I just think it's a fascinating presentation. 2 quick questions. Could you just say just a minute about Whitman and his objections? What we know about that I find to be very interesting. And secondly is that I'm completely related. Can you, it's quite a little bit off subject, but can you say a little bit about when percentage of those who voted was at its zenith? Is there a connection between the temper of the times or candidates? Are there some general guidelines that you could draw from history?
Michael, could you repeat each?
Yes, so absolutely. So the first question was about Walt Whitman opposing democracy and what exactly was his rationale. And he wrote about what he said was the wolfish corruption of politicians of the time, and that he felt that this is what happens when you let the masses of the time vote them in. And this goes actually to the second part of the question, which was what drove the high participation. We all know that in the late 1800s was a period not only of considerable public participation, but also public corruption. It was the time of Tammany Hall in New York and Boss Tweed and all the legendary characters we know about. The reason, the question was, when was participation at its height? And when you look at participation as a share, in effect, of who was legally allowed to participate, it was probably in the 1800s, when women couldn't vote, when African American men and women couldn't vote, but among white men it was very robust. It was a time of much greater party mobilization. And these political parties were emphatically participatory institutions. They rested their power on millions of people being involved. There was a festive aspect to it, a public tribalism almost that actually had a lot to do with why people participated. And I mentioned that ironically, one of the things that helped constrict this, which I wouldn't want to reverse this, but it's the secret ballot, among other things, made it less likely that people would vote. And it's a crazy thing, because why would that be the case? But think about if there were a law passed saying you could root for any football team you wanted, but you had to do it in private, and you couldn't tailgate, and so forth. People might have sports teams for which they rooted, but it wouldn't be the same. And in effect, we found, when you look at the level of mobilization of the public as the strategy in those days to win office versus the money-drenched system later, it was much more participatory then. So what we have to come up with is a way to not replicate, but to draw on that spirit now. And of course, there are many ways that people engage with each other, including through digital communities and other things. And we even have seen in some of the more successful political organizing efforts in recent years the public nature of that, whether it's the mass rallies that Trump and Sanders have had this time, or the canvassing operation of the Obama campaign. A colleague of ours, Eric Liu, has written quite a bit about the need to bring back that sense of public celebration to our democracy. Turns out it was really quite important. We don't want to replicate all of it, but it was not only corrupt. Some people have said, well, maybe the voter turnout rates were so high because it was all the cemeteries voting. But even when you factor that out, at that time it was said that the founders, the signers of the Declaration of Independence were still voting in Pennsylvania. But even if you factor that out, there was actually a lot more involvement back then. Yes, sir.
My name is Charlie Sullivan, and I direct the Prison Reform Organization. And of course, prisoner voting is one of the exciting things going on today. A few years back, there were actually 4 states that allowed prisoners to vote. Utah and Massachusetts were together. Today we have Maine and Vermont. They did away with those 2 states, the legislature, whatever, the governors led this. And to me, it was in violation of another issue, which is very exciting. And we actually, the United States, actually ratified the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which says that voting universal suffrage is there. That was actually ratified before the decision by those 2 states. It seems to me that I realize that it is not supposed to be implemented to a certain extent, but it is the law of this country, and to me that should have been challenged by someone. Maybe the Brennan Center had been in existence or whatever, had challenged it. Maybe those 2 states would not be able to deny voting rights for prisoners.
So the question is about voting rights for prisoners, people in prison, and, for example, international human rights conventions and the possible challenge to that practice that those could present.
Right. And it's one, if they had been ratified by the United States, which is, it was ratified. It was actually before those two states decided, but no one challenged it.
Well, I think that it's pretty unlikely that courts would strike down a practice in the United States for an international convention of that kind. That's always one of the controversies with these conventions. But it's also important to note, and the Brennan Center actually has brought these cases, felony disenfranchisement has long roots and actually is explicitly authorized in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, where it says states cannot restrict the right to vote except for somebody who's committed a felony or rebellion. So there is a long constitutional provenance to felony disenfranchisement. However, the way the system exists is unquestionably unfair, far harsher than other countries have it, and with a very significant racial impact. A lot of these laws were actually passed or created the way they were created during the Jim Crow era. And one of the positive developments that's happened is not so much about voting by people in prison, but what about the millions and millions of our fellow Americans who have been in prison or who have been part of the criminal justice system, people with past felony convictions. And that's something where there is a very encouraging and cross-ideological and often bipartisan movement to change our felony voting rules. It's interesting. It's something of a byproduct of the coming together of understanding around mass incarceration in the United States. As you know, both left and right are quite active right now in understanding, as has been frequently explained, that we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population. And that is not necessary to keep the cities and streets safe. And that there's a tremendous racial and social and economic cost to having a system like that. There's also a cost to our democracy. And so over the last 10 or 15 years, even while there have been all these partisan fights on voting going on over here, there's been a wonderful movement to end felony disenfranchisement or make it easier for people with past felony convictions, people who are in the community, they've served their sentence, they're paying taxes, they're doing the right thing to reintegrate in the community and vote. And there's been a lot of legal changes all over the place. We work with Chuck Colson in Prison Ministries, with Jack Kemp when they were, before they both passed away, major conservative and evangelical leaders. The Christian conservative movement is very involved. And as you know, here in Washington, D.C., there's been quite a bit of movement here. In Maryland last year, the legislature passed a law that restored the right to vote to 40,000 people with past felony convictions. The governor vetoed it, but it was overridden. And as you know, Governor McAuliffe, a few weeks ago, issued an executive action that has the consequence of giving up to 200,000 people the right to restore their right to vote. It's important to know we believe what he did was legal and constitutional. We urged him to do it. I think it will be upheld by the courts if it's challenged. But it's also the case that he and his Republican and Democratic predecessors as governor have been doing this bit by bit. This was not a bolt out of the blue. He followed on the previous governors of both parties. The big state where there's continuing to be, there's two states where there remains, there's 3 states with a lifetime ban on voting for anybody who's convicted of a felony, even if they were 18 and it was nonviolent drug possession or something like that. Iowa, Kentucky, and Florida. In Kentucky, Rand Paul is one of the great champions for doing something about that. Florida is very challenging. There are millions of people affected over time, and there's a constant push perhaps to get a ballot initiative for a constitutional amendment there, but you need 60% of the vote to pass a ballot initiative, so it's tough. But this is an area of optimism. Yes?
Did you say that the states that have started doing universal voter registration, that it's through the DMV?
That's where they started it.
Because, I mean, the government fines you when you're 65, whether you have a driver's license or not. I mean, why? I mean, it seems like that's still, focusing on people who have driver's licenses.
Right, and fewer. Not only do about 1 in 10 eligible voters not have a driver's license, but fewer and fewer have a driver's license. But younger people actually don't want to get driver's licenses. My 3 kids, it's actually been quite a challenge to get them to go do it. Nobody wants to stop at the DMV, but it greatly increases the number of people. Most people do go to the DMV and are registered through there, and it could be done through social welfare agencies. Selective service. All men when they turn 18, and as of 2 weeks ago, all women were now registered for selective service. And there is no reason that every 18-year-old eligible citizen can't be registered. You're exactly right. The government has us on a list. We're on plenty of lists. They use those lists for all different kinds of purposes, and it ought to be made possible for people to vote based on that.
2 more questions.
Yes.
Quick questions.
Ma'am.
My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation, especially from historic directions. But I just wonder, what then in our next step? And I think it's very important by history, and the way we improve our society is we really have to share our knowledge. And voters now, they don't have knowledge, because they are just obstructed with all information. They cover up and they change people's identity, they change candidates' identity, they take everything away from your property, so you cannot even do anything. And from local to federal, they really obstruct you from the testimony or to oppose the opponents or legislator or sponsors. So I just wonder if you can really put this effort to expand the knowledge of voters. So, and then you have to allow the candidate really to come out and have established their voice to be heard, and have a good, accurate archive of their statements and their positions. And the other day I just went to the Brennan conference, and I was really surprised. Brennan with Damon with
On civil rights, the leadership
civil
conference.
Human rights. And I was very surprised, because in so many years I have opposed public finance with a small donor fund matching. Because I would suppose you have to, from basic, you can televise candidate forum, you can have a public fund to establish the candidate archive, but they didn't do this. Instead they do the matching fund. I just thought that is a terrible thing to do. And then besides, I have communicated with all those organizations, and I tell them what's wrong with the current system. They destroy our society. So I, as a president of the Brennan Center, I really hope that you can really do the right directions. Otherwise, our society is going really down to a viral and a very vicious cycle. This is very much concern of me, and because I know I am objected and I deny for voting rights. I am denied for candidacy, and I'm then just taking away, drop all my everything, my right, my life, and my family life, and everything.
So
we've got to do something about it.
it seems
Thank you
to
for
me.
your question.
Thank you for your
Mike.
question. It
Yeah.
seems to me that there's 2 broad issues that you raise. One is, first of all, even if we had no legal barriers to participation, many Americans just don't participate. And there are a lot of reasons for that, ranging from elections that are not competitive because of redistricting and other things, and they don't feel they have a reason to participate, to lack of public engagement in a whole host of different ways. And so the answers, some of it is on us as citizens, some of it is making sure that information is available in a wide range, not just around elections or on election day. In fact, the changes in technology of how we communicate offer some very positive potential developments too. We talk about campaign finance, which was the other part of your question. That's driven, the massive increase in the role of money in the last 30 or 40 years was driven mostly by the need to buy 30-second TV ads on publicly licensed broadcast stations. That was why. And as we all know, that is a less and less important way of communicating with the public versus all the other ways we communicate. People who are now able to access information from candidates through digital means. Now that stuff's expensive too, but it actually isn't. It isn't close to being as expensive as the 30-second ad regime targeted at a sliver of swing voters, which is what we've been living through over the last several decades. That goes to the second part of your question, which was about the new version of public campaign finance. So the idea of public financing has always been that it's a public function running an election and a democracy, and if you can in effect replace the private money in some way, that you could give candidates a chance to represent a broader swath of the public. And some of the earlier versions of public financing, including the version that was quite successful for several decades for presidential campaigns, although it eventually was out of date, the idea was that you would give a big block of money to the candidate if they qualified, and then they were done, they wouldn't raise it anymore. The new version actually seeks to boost participation. It doesn't try to get all the private money out of politics. It doesn't pretend you can try to get all the private money out. What it does is try to boost the voices of small donors, of ordinary people. And the most successful model in the country so far is actually used in New York City. Small donors there get a 6-to-1 match from taxpayers, and it hasn't changed everything, but it's changed very much who can run, who they listen to, how they run their campaigns, and the competitiveness of campaigns. You'll still have Michael Bloomberg spending $100 million at a pop to win the mayoralty, but other than him, who's kind of an outlier, it's actually been a tremendously widely used and tremendously effective system that I think would make a big difference if we could bring it to Congress and the presidency. Last question. I'll be quick.
My question is about actually voting on election day. I presume there are rules and laws about hours that polling places have to be open, where they can be, access to people in different communities. I know in the primary there was a big issue in Arizona where they, I guess, have reduced the number of polling places. So I'm just curious what the state of play is around that, and are there states trying to restrict that or sort of manipulate?
Yeah, the answer is yes. The question was about the actual hours on election day. Are those subject to controversy and manipulation? And the answer is yes. We don't have a national election in this country. We don't even have state elections. We have thousands of counties running elections. We have tried as a country, when we've been good at this, to set national standards for what the bare minimum is. That, in effect, was part of what the Voting Rights Act was. In Maricopa County this year, which previously had been covered by the Voting Rights Act and no longer is, by Section 5, a local official decided, gee, what would happen if we closed 70% of the polling places in the heavily Hispanic Maricopa County, and not surprisingly, people had to wait hours and hours online. And that would not, even if it was not malevolent, which we don't know, it would have been stopped by the Voting Rights Act. There ought to be a national standard for, at the very least, making sure there's enough voting machines per person on election day and enough opportunities for early voting. There's a bipartisan commission appointed by President Obama, led by Ben Ginsberg, who was Mitt Romney's chief counsel, and Bob Bauer, who was his chief counsel, that proposed national standards on early voting, on voting machines, and all this kind of stuff. It's a really good, it's the right set of policies. There actually could be federal legislation. There was a bill called the Count Every Vote Act about 10 years ago that embodied a lot of this stuff. And Hillary Clinton was the sponsor, and she has made clear in her campaign that this is something she would want federal legislation on, as well as automatic universal registration. The thing to remember is, right now, about 1 out of 3 people don't vote on election day. So the market, there's really been customer service here by election officials in states. It's much more convenient in this day and age for people to vote early or absentee or by mail or whatever. Some of us are unfortunate enough to live in places that don't have those, and New York is backwards on almost every front. In North Carolina, the state legislature passed a kind of a greatest hits voter suppression bill that had every single bad idea all in one piece of legislation, and it was challenged in court, and last year there was a trial, and North Carolina's defense was, they said, as bad as we are now, we're not as bad as New York. We cut back on early voting. New York doesn't have early voting. We ended same-day registration. New York never had it in the first place, and on and on. So there are wide variations, but there's an inexorable consumer demand for ways to vote other than standing online on Election Day, and I'm sure that that will continue to be the case.
Michael, thank you very
you.
much. You've done it again. You get a wonderful civics lesson when you get a book talk from Michael. That happened with the first book. It happened again today. I want to thank him very much for the presentation, his patience, for your patience, and have a chance to speak with him at the book signing in the back. The books are for sale at the Library of Congress employee discount, 10%. Take advantage of that and have another have an opportunity to get his signature as well. Thanks for joining us. One more round of applause for Michael Waldman.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.